Such an experiment was always a fantasy. It could never be carried out.
It always struck me as a fascinating idea which real-world conditions couldn't create. And that's why the Nicaragua situation is so important, because here children, for a very obvious and concrete reason, have no exposure to the language spoken by their parents, and thus they have to create it themselves.
The deaf children of Nicaragua were brought out of their isolation for the first time when schools like this vocational center in Managua opened after the revolution. The school is now closed, but in the early 80s, 50 students came here every day. 50 students who couldn't hear, couldn't talk, couldn't lip read, and who had no sign language.
O sea, no había un lenguaje para nosotros conocido para enseñar y para comunicarnos. O sea, era bien difícil. Nosotros con los niños, con las mímicas, nosotros entendíamos o adivinábamos, mejor dicho, lo que ellos decían, lo que ellos querían comunicar.
The school brought in teachers from East Germany to try to teach the students to lip read, but it was a dismal failure, as they simply didn't understand what was going on. However, between the students themselves, something startling had begun to happen. They were finding their own way to communicate.
Importante porque ellos eran muy expresivos en sus en los gestos, sus expresiones en el rostro, en las manos. Ellos daban una expresión bastante para que nosotros pudiéramos entender qué es lo que ellos querían decirnos.
The students had started signing to each other, and their signing developed so fast that it was soon too complicated for the teachers to follow by guesswork.
Cuando ellos conversaban mucho entre el grupo, platicaban muchas cosas, de que iban a fiestas, que bailaban. Nosotros, ¿entendiste, Mariana? Nada, nada.
The teachers turned to the new government for some expert help, and the expert they were sent was American linguist Judy Kegel.
What I asked them was, what do you want? What do you want here in the school? What do you need? And their answer was, we need to understand what those deaf kids are talking about.
Judy Kegel works with deaf people in sign languages the world over. Here, her first task was to get to know the students so that they would teach her their signs.
You know, the very first day I met Mavel and Joconda and Ada and Juanita. So I've been looking at and following their signing from day one.
We didn't know any proper signs then, but you used that video camera and you took loads of photos. We told you our name signs and you took photos of them.
Yoconda and I were checking you out without you even knowing it. I remember we came and asked if you were from the United States, and you said you were. You followed us around all the time. We were supposed to be cutting hair, but we were curious. We wanted to talk to you and to find out what you were writing down.
Most people believe where there are deaf people, there's a sign language. We knew there were deaf people here. I assumed that there would be a whole history of a sign language. When I got here, what I discovered was that there was something very different about the situation, about the kind of sign language I was being exposed to. As a linguist, I'm looking for consistency. I'm trying to figure out the various types of constructions that it uses. And from individual to individual, there's variation. Then when I focus on a single person, there's variation even there. And I began to wonder whether, you know, I was just losing it. It was very, very difficult.
The signing had no predictable grammar. There was no pattern to the way the signs fitted together. Judy began to doubt that this was a language after all. But that was hardly surprising. Before the school had opened, each teenager had had nothing but their own set of individual home signs.
At primary school, there were no signs. There was nothing. For example, we didn't even know how to say mama, papa. I felt really different being deaf.
When I was 10 years old, I understood nothing. I didn't even know what it meant to think. Thinking meant nothing to me. Sometimes, how can I put it? I waved my hands around, but it wasn't signing. You would have thought me a bit crazy with all my wild gestures. Even with my family, one-to-one, if I wanted something, or like an ice cream, I had to show them the man with the trolley and point. Then my father would understand and get one for me.
Kids who all came together with their different home sign systems then had to arrive in a common system. They've got these very independent, mutually incomprehensible systems, and they had to converge on something that they could all use to communicate with each other.
Anne Senghas worked with Judy, analyzing the detail of the early signing. It put her in mind of what linguists call a pidgin.
It's kind of like pidgins that we see today when people from very different language groups are thrown together and have to communicate with each other. They'll come up with a pidgin. That's a fairly sparse language. It'll have some vocabulary, but not a lot of grammar.
That same summer, Judy Kegel visited a primary school in Managua, where she met deaf children who had first come together when they were much younger than the vocational students. In particular, she remembers a young girl called Mayela.
We're all deaf here and we've grown up together. As you can see, we're all good friends. Everyone is learning to write. They also try to teach us to speak. Over there, they teach typing. If we can type, we can get a good job when we leave school in August.
I just remember that moment of all of a sudden making contact with Mayela and going, aha, species identification, this is the language. I looked across this courtyard and I went, somebody gave that woman the rule book. You know, it was looking at Mayela's signing was like having somebody wipe the film off your brain and go, whoa, I mean, there it is.
At school, they put earphones on us and tried to get us to speak. You were allowed to write, but nothing else. You weren't allowed to sign. But outside lessons, I watched the older people who were deaf. They were using signs. I kept watching, and little by little, I learned the sign language from them.
As Mayela had grown up, she had taken the early pidgin signing to new heights.
It was very crisp and very clear. It was very orchestrated. It was things overlapping with others. It was second nature. There was a sense of, yes, it's understood. What I've transmitted is understood.
But Mayela wasn't alone. There was a whole new generation growing up in the primary school who were just as confident and fluent as she was. Somehow, they had turned the early signing into a grammatical language.
The young kids, the first one that does it, comes out with something that has it all. I think that in essence, each of those young children was giving birth to a new language.
This situation is a linguist's dream. You've got a whole group of kids, they come together, they're generating a new language, and we can just watch what these children are doing and see language genesis.
This little guy in the Czech cartoon is useful because I want to understand, I want to be able to compare each of the deaf signers here in Nicaragua, and I need some common baseline to compare.
Judy got signers to watch Mr. Kumal and then to retell his stories to her and her camera.
They elicit the kind of grammatical constructions I'm looking for. So I can get aspects of the grammar, enough of it, a snippet of what I need from each individual signer, and still know exactly what they intend to be talking about.
In this tale, Mr. Kumal has been reduced to begging at the side of the road, and a man in a passing car tosses him a coin.
What we're really trying to do with these videotapes when we get them back to our laboratory is crack the code. I mean, how are they expressing a story, and what are the rules that underlie the way that, you know, the different signs that they use are related to each other.
Over the years, Judy and her team recorded most of the deaf community in Managua telling the stories of Mr. Kumal. And by analyzing the tapes, they've pinpointed the differences between the full language and the early signing.
One of the characteristics that you see in this generation has to do with how you refer to the objects that are involved. We can talk about the trajectory of the coin going into someone's hand, or we might want to actually focus on the object. Again, this notion of something that classifies objects, like the coin going into a person's hand. The first generation signers will do the trajectory for the coin. So the coin gets thrown, but the trajectory of the coin comes into the hand.
In comparison, the language of the second generation is more detailed and more grammatical.
Let's look at Juan Carlos, one of the younger generation. Now, he is talking about the exact same thing, but notice the differences. He does the car with an object classifier coming through and then driving the car, throwing the coin over his shoulder, and being able to take that classifier that marks flat, round objects for coin and have it go into his hand.
Even as someone new to the community, I was struck by differences in just in fluency among people that I met. We wanted to find a way to measure that. So we just counted how many signs they were signing in a given minute of time. And the younger signers, in fact, signed twice as many signs per minute as the older signers. Not only are they signing more signs in a minute, but there's a lot more meaning in these signs as well, because they're putting different kinds of grammatical markers that shows how the signs relate to each other in the sentence. And that really makes their signing carry a lot of information in a short amount of time. And that also accounts for the fluency that you see when you interact with them.
This little boy is one of the youngest signers they have ever tested, and his telling of Mr. Kumal's tale is packed with detail.
Okay, I'm just going to try to voice this as it's happening. So he's driving the car, and the guy who had seen that he didn't have anything in his pocket was crying because he had nothing, and the other guy threw something over his shoulder. The first one thought he was going to enjoy, but all it was a dirty old coin. His signing is so chock full of complexity and structure and everything that one could want in a sign language, and yet it's produced completely effortlessly without a second thought.
The more Judy worked on the tapes, the clearer it became that in just a few years, these children had created a fully grammatical, fluent language. But it still wasn't clear where this language had come from.
Digo, no importa, no importa. Aquí de vos, I'm tired with you. Pero mira, hay que trabajar para comer.
A fijarle, pues, vámonos, y entonces este gesto significa que ya vamos de viaje, pues.
No, she and I, we are together.
You can't just look at sign language in isolation. The signs that people are using have to come from somewhere. Even though we're saying the language came into being whole cloth, that doesn't mean that the material of which it's made came out of the heads of these children with no basis in what's going on in the culture.
People in Nicaragua use a lot of gestures when they talk, and there are clear similarities between some gestures and some deaf signs. It was even possible that the new sign language was no more than an extension of the gestures. To investigate the idea, Judy went out with Henry, who was deaf, and tested members of the Nicaraguan public with proper signs from the sign language.
Ah, la mesa. Ah, no, eso no. Together? Ah, no, speaking.
That's a sign for novio, for my love.
Would you like it?
You do like this one, it just means my girlfriend, or this? What's the difference?
No, girlfriend. Yeah, this another more than girlfriend.
It's pretty good. I mean, most hearing people around here are pretty adept at using and communicating in gesture. That doesn't mean that they're good at understanding signs. If you looked at Danilo, when Henry would shift to actually using a sign, he just was clueless. He basically went, I don't know what that is. That's a sign, a formal sign.
Bus?
That's a bus.
Driver of bus.
The gestures that hearing people use are not the same as our sign language. If I'm talking to a hearing person, I might be able to say, you, me, let's go somewhere in the car, and then we meet and go together. But to a deaf person, I could say much more. Come to my house, and then we'll go out and play a game, maybe some basketball. Then we might decide to get 3 people together for one team, and 3 for another. And I would say, why don't we have a match? Then what time shall we go? How about 7 o'clock in a few hours' time? Okay, I'll meet you then, and we'll go together.
The new sign language was much more than an extension of Nicaraguan gestures. Gestures might have influenced odd bits of vocabulary, but they couldn't account for the grammar that knits the language together. However, if the children hadn't copied their language from the world around them, how had they created it?
Me llamo Juan, tengo 10 años. Yo me llamo Dinora Alemán Padilla del Carmen, tengo 12 años. Se llama Raúl Antonio, tiene 3 años.
Linguists have wondered how even hearing children learn to speak when the language that surrounds them is so broken, so degenerate.
Tape record yourself over lunch, then look for how many times you actually speak a complete sentence. Very rarely. Then take that input and now say you're 2 years old. You have no link yet to meaning. I mean, you don't know what a given word means. Everything you're getting is noise. There is no nice, clean, neat, here's the sentences, let me break them down for you nicely, and here's the rules that you do. That never happens. And hearing kids learn it all the time.
Bueno, mi nombre es Byron, tengo 12 años, vendo pólvora aquí en el mercado Roberto Güembe.
Indeed, that children speak fluently despite this degenerate input might be evidence that language is a biological instinct. The idea was first put forward in the 50s by revolutionary linguist Noam Chomsky.
Superficially, it may seem surprising that a child should be designed, engineered, if you like, to create language from nothing. But when you think about it, it's not surprising. Every child creates language from essentially nothing. The same is true of the circulatory system or the immune system or having legs rather than wings and so on.
It's like going through puberty, okay? Your mother may sit down with you and tell you what's going to happen, okay? You may have some expectation that things are going to happen, right? But when it all comes into being, you know, basically your body takes over, it follows a certain set of rules, it goes through a particular developmental pattern, and it just takes its place. Nothing about understanding either the chemical process or what one does or when it happens or scheduling things is going to make any difference. Language is like that.
Chomsky argued that the part of language most likely to be biological is not so much the meaning of the words as the grammar we use to put them together.
Take the sentence, John ate an apple. Let's say we've gotten to the point where the child understands that. We hear John ate. Okay, let's say the child understands that to mean John's eating something or other. Well, there's a kind of a principle. The principle says that if something is missing, that you understand it to mean something or other. Okay, that's natural. Take it a step further. Take the sentence, John is too stubborn to talk to Bill. Okay, that means John is so stubborn that he won't talk to Bill. Drop out the last word Bill, just like we dropped out the last word apple. John is too stubborn to talk to. Well, by the principle we just used, it ought to mean John is so stubborn that he won't talk to someone or other, which is perfectly sensible, but it doesn't mean that. It means that John is so stubborn that someone or other won't talk to him, John. So we invert the interpretation. A child can go through its whole life without having heard evidence relevant to these interpretations, and they're known instantly.
I have never really been terribly impressed by that particular part of the Chomskyan argument. I don't really see that input to children is all that degenerate, and I think a lot of linguists agree with me on that one. Children's minds are plastic to a degree that we adults can just barely imagine. So as far as that goes, I've never completely understood the complete confidence with which Chomsky and his followers assert that this indicates that there was an innate language competence.
To prove Chomsky right, linguists needed to find a clear case where a new language had been created by children, so they turned to Creoles.
Where was the captain when the launch turned over? Down in the harbor with his load of banana. Who make the launch turn over? Harman Booker make the launch turn over.
1, 2, 3. Launch turn over, launch turn over.
Creole languages grow up in places where people of different races came together. As luck would have it, one of the oldest Creoles in the world is spoken in Nicaragua, on the Caribbean side of the country, along the Mosquito Coast.
Bien, amigos oyentes, esta es Radio Sinica, que transmite desde el corazón de la costa atlántica de Nicaragua, Bluefields, en 95.9 FM estéreo. Sinica, la voz costeña.
Brown skin girl, stay home on my baby. Brown skin girl, stay home on my baby. 'Cause I'm going away.
In Bluefields, the main town on the Mosquito Coast, Spanish, Creoles, native Indians, and the British have lived together for hundreds of years. The result is that some people define their race by their color, while others define themselves by the language they speak.
And they cannot say they are black.
But they can't say they are white either.
They cannot say they are black. They can say mostly they are white.
Well, I asked him, you know, what color is this in Nicaraguan Spanish?
Well,
and he said, moreno. And I said, so does that mean, am I a negro or am I a moreno? And he said that I was a moreno. And I thought, that's nice, so I have a classification. Because in the United States, you wouldn't describe me as the brown linguist. You know, I mean, you know, I'm a black linguist. You know, there is no other kind except for the white kind. You know, in the Asian.
That's the same problem I'm telling you right now happens here. For example, we are all black, but then they use the ethnic group to distinguish. We are Creole, they are Creole. They are black, but they're not Creole. So we identify ourselves with Creole.
We are Creole by our language. I always try to tell them, let's clear up this. I am black and I speak Creole, you know?
The origin of the Bluefields Creole lies in the turbulent history of the Caribbean. Bluefields itself is not named after any romantic blue pasture, but after a Dutch pirate, Abraham Blauvelt, who passed through back in the 17th century. And he wasn't the only one. English-speaking pirates and buccaneers like Captain Morgan plied the coast as well, and some became colonists, set up plantations, and staffed them with slaves imported from across the Caribbean.
The English set up plantation economies and staffed these with African slave labor. And as a result, you had places where there were many, many, many more Africans than whites, and Africans spent more time talking to each other than to whites, and so a new language formed.
They don't like to mix neither, you know.
John McWhirter specializes in the kind of emergency language, or pidgin, that has arisen throughout history when people like the slaves, who spoke different languages, were forced together and needed to communicate.
A pidgin is not something that you could write a book in. It's not something that could be spoken right or wrong. It's a rudimentary, makeshift, ding-dong kind of language with very minimal structure. A Creole is what happens when that language, for one reason or another, becomes the main language of a community. It becomes a language people identify themselves through. It's something which has rules that can be spoken long. It becomes a full language.
And maybe ubal mo na ubak kukaki.
I don't go class. No hurry go bed. Without any pain in your
And this is what I taught when I was a baby. And this is what we call the home language. What we talk that every day, every night, anywhere we go, you know. And all the way.
For linguists, the fascination lies in how Creoles were created, and whether the language instinct really was at work when that happened. The claim is that this language formed 200 or 300 years ago, when children who grew up surrounded by a pidgin put it through the filter of their inborn language instinct and spontaneously turned it into a grammatical Creole, a real language.
There is shockingly little evidence for how Creoles formed. We just don't know. Most of these languages formed in the 1600s, and really nobody was there to document what was going on. You read the literature and there are all these vaguely authoritative statements made, but really nobody was there in a periwig writing about how the slaves were beginning to talk funny outside. My feeling about a bio program and innateness and language was that Creoles, for better or for worse, were not the place to look for answers to that question.
But the way the Nicaraguan Sign Language emerged was a close parallel to how a pidgin might turn into a Creole. The older students had come together and developed a kind of pidgin signing. Then the younger ones took that and turned it into a Creole, a proper new language.
I had come to the conclusion that we were probably never going to see a demonstration of the spontaneous emergence of language. But here is a situation where children have indisputably created a language spontaneously with next to no input. And here it is. It's the 1990s. We can see this happening. I can honestly say that I find Judy Kegel's work to be one of the most thoroughly exciting finds in linguistics today. And I really mean that.
For us, the deaf people, the new language has been very important. 15 years ago, when we started the sign language, we were just a small group of teenagers who had nothing. Now we are ready to publish a dictionary of our own sign language, and this will help us communicate with both deaf people and people who can hear.
The Nicaraguan case appears to be a very rich example, the richest yet known, of a natural experiment in which a language-like system, maybe an actual human language, was developed on the basis of no external inputs, as far as we know. And that's intriguing.
The Nicaraguan Sign Language has now been accepted as hard evidence for an innate language instinct. But Judy Kegel's work has gone on to add a crucial extra element to Chomsky's theory of innateness.
In 1994, it became easier for us to travel around the country, and I've always wanted to get out and see, has the sign language that developed along the Pacific coast made its way over to the Atlantic coast? What we found was home signers. We found home signers in their homes.
While Managua had developed the new language, here, for deaf people still isolated at home, nothing had changed.
We used to think that if you took a child and you put them in a nurturing environment and they had parents that fed them and interacted with them and socialized with them, that language would just somehow come into being because language is some sort of instinct. I don't think that's the case. From being here and looking at family after family after family where there's a deaf child with hearing parents, I'm convinced that a deaf child left in the home will remain language-less.
The language instinct seems to need a certain minimum amount of raw material to work on.
And a shirt, and a Band-Aid.
When Judy first met Dolby 3 years ago, all she had were a few simple home signs. And one set of home signs was not enough to trigger the birth of a language, even the birth of a pigeon.
Hamburger. These are to get spatial locations. Right. Car in front of a tree. An apple.
In the schools in Managua, enough students had come together with enough different home signs to kick the language instinct into action.
Very common here. And a bug. And a clock. And a bed. Oh. You want to go to bed?
Without friends to sign with, Dolby would never develop a language. Judy realized that it is vital to add company to Chomsky's language instinct.
Father and mother, if your children then can't hear nor talk, bring them to the class of Nicaraguan Sign Language. From 1 o'clock at the Phonics Center, right in front of Salman Restaurant, bring them. We wait for them.
To speed up their process of gaining a language, Judy decided that the home signers she had met up and down the Caribbean coast should be brought together and taught the new sign language. So in 1995, with the help of Javier and others from Managua, she came out to Bluefields and set up a school for signing. Here no one has created a language. Students of all ages are being taught to sign. But the school gave Judy a unique chance to discover more about the nature of the language instinct and the critical years when it works best.
We have a group of students that span the age ranges that are crucial for critical period for language acquisition. They've all been exposed to the full-fledged form of Nicaraguan Sign Language, so we're able to track each individual student and their mastery of the sign language that's used here.
The idea that children learn languages more easily than adults is not new, but following this group has allowed Judy to tie it directly in with a language instinct.
Our natural abilities are probably there all the time, but something about the maturation process what a child does from ages 0 to 7. That's the point at which children are analyzing language, taking it apart, looking at the little pieces, doing the kinds of things you need to do to fully appreciate all the aspects of the language that you need to speak. After age 8 until about age 15, it's not that the door is completely closed. In fact, recent research has shown that it seems to gradually creak shut. And if their exposure is delayed for some reason until after 15, they are no longer able to acquire language in the way that we know it.
Anselmo was 16 when he first started to sign. 2 years later, he can handle the language well enough to help teach the others in the Bluefield school. But he will never be any better at it than a talented teenager learning a foreign language. Adela, on the other hand, was 4 when the school opened. She should grow up signing a full and fluent language. These limits on the age when the language instinct operates explain what Judy saw in Managua in the early days of the sign language. The students at the vocational school were all in their late teens when they set the ball rolling, turning their home signs into language, just as the door to the language instinct was creaking shut. These were the kids that Judy met first, and it was their pigeon signing that so confused her in the beginning. At the primary school, though, children like Henry and Mayella grew up signing a fully grammatical language because they had the pidgin as their input, and they were young enough for their language instinct to be operating at full strength. And the evolution of this language still continues at the primary school today. In 1992, the new sign language was officially accepted by the schools in Managua, and it is making a huge difference to the young children who live with it, including Barney, who is the best signer that Nicaragua has ever seen.
Escuela. Sí, ¿cómo es? Oye, disculpa, mejor es que yo le pregunte a Yvonne. Yvonne hace mucho mejor las señas a Barney.
Barney, what did you do at school today?
At 6:30, I wake up and have a shower, have something to eat, and then finish brushing my teeth and get dressed. When I get to school, we stand up in a line and say, "Hello, Julia." She's our teacher. Then at 7:30, they raise a flag, and the whole school sings "Hail to thee, Nicaragua." You know. In lessons, we did maths. She's teaching us our times tables. It's hard. I don't know all my 3s yet, but I know my 2s pretty well, but not the 4s.
So this is the closest we are going to get here right now to a native signer. This is not a deaf child of deaf parents, but this is a deaf child of a deaf aunt who is extremely nurturing in her sign language exposure that she allows him to have.
Barney's Aunt Yvonne was one of the second generation of signers. She was signing the full Nicaraguan Sign Language by the time Barney was born.
I thought Barney, poor him, I have to teach him, but I had to work as well. So I told him I would teach him on Saturdays and Sundays. When he was 2, we talked to him and clapped, and he didn't hear anything. So we knew he was deaf. So I taught him little by little. And then when he grew up and went to school, I still liked to help him at the weekends.
With Yvonne's good input, his own language instinct, and friends at school to sign with, this 11-year-old boy has developed a more sophisticated grasp of the new sign language than anyone else.
Yo pienso que sería como algo, un objeto que está allí sin ninguna función, que hay que darle de comer, como un animalito. Hay que darle de comer, hay que buscarle donde dormir, hay que bañarlo y nada más. No ver, descubrir a la necesidad que él tiene. Por eso es importante las señas, porque por medio de las señas expresa sus necesidades, sus alegrías, sus tristezas.
What gets me most excited is going onto the playground and seeing two kids debating anything. I don't care whether it's the latest Rambo movie or the latest Nintendo game, with just absolutely no problem. I mean, without even thinking about it, just being able to do that. That's what gets me.
Today, the original signers, Managua's class of '86, are adults. They have their own families and their own community. Since the revolution, the world of the deaf in Nicaragua has changed beyond all recognition.
Every child here represents the future for this language. If we take all of them and give them the kind of nurturing that someone like Barney was able to get, namely let the deaf community give them their sign language and give it to them as early as possible, they're the future, because they're the ones that then give back in spades in terms of the grammar that they share with the older generations.
The new sign language may have been a boon to linguists the world over, but its value to these people is immeasurable.
We advanced little by little to get to where we are today with teachers and a dictionary. Every day our community becomes stronger and more people can learn to sign. And I wanted to tell you something. Our language is not something we got from other countries. It is pure Nicaraguan. It is ours.
Everyone has said that our sign language is very pretty, and here in Managua we agree. Our language improves every day, and in the future we think it's going to get better still.